This week we are looking at what I'm calling traditional ethical decision-making methods, um, consisting of two approaches to making moral decisions, which are um, basically Kantianism. Let me go to my notes. Uh, right, Kantianism. You'll sometimes see this called deontology, and there's reasons for that, but I avoid that term. I think it's unnecessary. Once you know Kant's philosophy, there's no reason. We'll maybe explain a little later what that means. But Kantianism and utilitarianism being the other one, which is a form of consequentialism, and that is a term you should know because it's meaningful. I mean, so is deontology, but it's a very useful term, especially to contrast it with Kantianism, which is definitely not a form of consequentialism, as we'll see. Wanted to start the course, as I said in the introductory video, with just some basic moral philosophy, very much boiled down. I mean, Kant and John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism in general, and Kantianism and deontology in general are huge parts of moral philosophy, discussion of moral philosophy, and have been for a very long time. And we're doing 1 week on it. So I'm really boiling it down to something that I think is very practical. That is to not go into a lot of the theoretical and really not to go into a lot of the theoretical argument about either of them, but rather just to see, well, what advice do they give us, Kant and the utilitarians, in terms of actually making moral decisions about how to go about it? I mean, moral philosophy in general is really fascinating and can be completely theoretical. Theoretical inquiry into ethics, but that's really not what this class is about. This class is applied ethics. It's a kind of a funny applied ethics course because of subject matter, but it's still applied ethics. So we're looking to Kant and utilitarians for something useful, for a guide, advice, suggestions, let's say, about how to make moral decisions. So if we start with Kant, who is, wrote a lot about moral philosophy, but the most famous things that come out of Kant's moral philosophy are the categorical imperatives. There are actually three, but a third one is rather, I think, different in nature. But the first two are really very practical. Categorical imperatives are rules that Kant thinks must be followed. Must be followed if you want to be ethical, right? If you want to do the right thing. And really, Kantianism is really about doing the right thing in a certain sense. An imperative is an order or command, and if something's categorical, it's exceptionless. There's no qualification. If somebody states something categorically, they just state it without any kind of, again, qualification, without any hypothetical if. They just state something. And an imperative is an order or command. So a categorical imperative would be an order or command that we must always follow in any circumstances, which is a very tall order, right? To think of such a thing, that would be, I suppose, always right to do. But as you'll see, the way that these imperatives are worded, the way that they're crafted, is exactly to be something that can always be followed. So there are two of them here, and think about them. I don't know. Are they something that you think always need to be followed? Let's see what he says first. So I gave you the first categorical imperative first. I'll read it through. Of course, it's translated from the German, but it's still kind of hard to suss out. But it's actually quite simple, I think. Kant says at a certain point, and this is from the Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals, which is kind of a short version of his moral philosophy, if you can believe it. Says, I do not therefore need any far-reaching penetration to discern what I have to do in order that my will may be morally good. Inexperienced in the course of the world, incapable of being prepared for all its contingencies, I only ask myself, canst thou also will that thy maxim, your maxim, should be a universal law? If not, then it must be rejected. Okay? You can even stop there. That's the most important part. You're thinking of doing something. You're thinking of doing anything that presents to you and your consciousness some sort of moral ambiguity. Ask yourself, first of all, what is the maxim that you are acting on? And that just means the rule. If I walk down the street and I see somebody walking a puppy and I kick the puppy, then the rule by which I'm acting is that you should kick puppies. If I walk down the street and an old lady has fallen with her grocery bags and I help her up and make sure she's okay, then my maxim is you should help old ladies when they're in stress. Or if I walk by without giving her a second glance, that it's okay to ignore old ladies. And he said, whatever it is, that's your maxim. It's a rule or generalization of your behavior. And so you ask yourself, what is the rule that you would be acting by if you were to do a certain thing? And then you ask, could it be a universal law? Canst thou also will that thy maxim should be a universal law? That is, can you, with a straight face, can you stand behind that rule as something that everyone should follow? Right? If not, then it must be rejected. That is, if you find that the maxim by which you're acting is not something that you can universalize, and if we think about the first version of the categorical imperative, it is often called the one about universalizability. If the maxim of your action was just the general rule by which you're acting, if it's not something that you can will that everyone should follow too, then you know you shouldn't do it, because whatever you do, your action should be universalizable. And this gets into all areas. I mean, basically, if you realize that you don't want that to be a universal law, but you do it anyway, you're being bad. You're making an exception for yourself, which you know you're being unethical. And we all do that sometimes, right? No one's perfect, but the idea is that if it's about, maybe one could say integrity. That is, you have certain beliefs about what should be done, but if you don't follow those beliefs, you're a hypocrite. Right? But in any case, that's the first categorical imperative. Canst thou also will that thy maxim should be a universal law? If not, then it must be rejected. And he goes on to some other things there, but maybe get us into other issues. But that's really the thing to keep in mind: universalizability in the first one. The second version of the categorical imperative is perhaps even more important, and I would say historically very important, because it goes farther really than giving you a rule for remaining ethical. It sort of characterizes the way the world should be in a certain respect. And it really starts with Kant it's a result of Kant looking for something in the world that he thinks has absolute value, as opposed to mere relative value. He thinks that is absolutely necessary in order to provide a grounding, as he's doing, for morality. That is, if everything was just of relative value, then there would be no morality. He has to find something in the world that is really of absolute value, and he thinks he has such a thing at hand, and it's basically us, we persons. He says, now I say, man, and generally any rational being, exists as an end in himself, not merely as a means to be arbitrarily used by this or that will, but in all his actions, whether they concern himself or other rational beings, must be always regarded at the same time as an end. So if we think of things in terms of being means or being ends, in the world, as we deal with the world, oftentimes the same thing can, in different contexts, be both. When we're cooking the meal, the meal is the end of all our actions, right? It's the purpose or goal. That's what end here means. That for the sake of which, the goal, the aim, that which it has value. So when we're cooking the meal, it's the finished meal that is the end, and it's the cooking, it's the means to the end. But then when the meal is finished, it's the enjoyment of the meal, which is the end, and the meal itself, the food itself, becomes a means. So what Kant is looking for is something that's not like food or something else like that, or almost anything else, but something that's always an end and should never be a means. And he thinks that he's found that in us, in persons. Now, I say man, and generally any rational being, exists as an end in himself, not merely as a means to be arbitrarily used by this or that will, but in all his actions, whether they concern himself or other rational beings, must be always regarded at the same time as an end. And then he has some things about the inclinations, which are interesting. But then he says, the worth of any object which is to be acquired by our action is always conditional. Like everything else in the world, we assign it worth. Things have economic worth, things have emotional, whatever, personal worth. But that worth is always conditional. And the condition is things become worthy because we want them, right? I mean, the hamburger is worthy. It has worth. It has value. If I'm hungry and I'm a meat eater, if I'm not hungry or I'm a vegetarian, it's worthless. So its worth depends upon somebody wanting it. Its value depends upon somebody desiring it. It has a conditional value. If somebody is hungry and they are not a vegetarian, then the hamburger has worth. Right? But if those things don't apply, the hamburger does not have worth. So that's why we say the worth of those things is conditional. What he's looking for is something that has unconditional value. And then he gets to some things which would again take us off because they have to do with animals. He says beings whose existence depends not on our will but on nature's have, nevertheless, if they are irrational beings, only a relative value as means and are therefore called things. That's a very important sentence. It has a lot of freight there. One of the things he's doing when he talks about irrational beings is basically talking about animals and denying the idea, which some would hold, surely, that animals also have absolute value. But he's making a very important distinction there when he says that irrational beings have only relative value and can be called things. And that use of the word things is very important in understanding, I think, this passage, because it's the contrast between things and rational beings that really sets the whole thing up, and are therefore called things. Rational beings, on the contrary, are called persons. So, okay, because their very nature points them out as ends in themselves, that is, as something which must not be used merely as means, and so far, therefore, restricts our freedom of action and is an object of respect. Very important, I think, a very important idea. The idea that persons and things are two entirely different kinds of being. A thing is something that is okay to use. A rational being cannot be used. And that's, I think, what it means, essentially, to say that a rational being or a person, which is a rational being and person are really synonymous here. That a person cannot be used means, though the person be treated as an end in themselves, means they cannot be used like a thing. That whatever you do, don't mix these things up. There are persons that have inherent value and need always to be treated as ends in themselves, and there are things which have only relative value and can be used as a means to an end. So the worst thing you can do is to use a person because, he says, their very nature points them out, as ends in themselves. That is, as something which must not be used merely as means, and so far, therefore, restricts freedom of action and is an object of respect. That restriction of freedom of action is really quite interesting and something to think about. When it comes to things, our action is not restricted. We're free to do whatever we want with and to things. If I have just bought a lovely table at the store and I bring it home and it gives me gratification to smash it, it's okay. I have no restriction in my freedom of action. Freedom of action comes in limits to what we can do when we're dealing with persons. Right? When I meet another person and they meet me, there's a mutual recognition that each of us is limited in what we can do with respect to the other. And to use another meaning of the word respect, that we must respect each other. We must treat each other in whatever minimal way it turns out to be, as ends rather than as means. I mean, we do use each other. We persons, we exploit each other. We treat each other like things, and that's what's called being wrong, right? That's what's called being wrong. So here is in bold here at the bottom is the actual imperative. He starts out saying, if then there is a supreme practical principle, or in respect of the human will, a categorical imperative, it must be one which, being drawn from the conception of that which is necessarily an end for everyone, because it is an end in itself, that would be the person, right? That the person is an end in itself, so the person is an end for everyone too, constitutes an objective principle of will, and can therefore serve as a universal practical law. The foundation of this principle is, and I'm right here, rational nature exists as an end in itself. That is, you and I as persons, as rational creatures, we have inherent value. We don't have relative value, we have absolute value. We exist as ends in ourselves. Man necessarily conceives his own existence as being so. That is, you and I, we recognize our own inherent value. So far, then, this is a subjective principle of human actions. But every other rational being regards its existence similarly, just on the same rational principle it holds for me. So that it is at the same time an objective principle. That is, I value myself. I give myself inherent value. I realize that all other persons do too. So if I value myself, and I value myself because I am a free being, basically a rational creature, and I recognize that other persons are also free and rational, then to be consistent, I have to value them too, and not for what they do for me. That's the point. I don't value them because I love them. I don't value them because they're useful to me. I value them just because of what they are. So then we get finally to the imperative here. Accordingly, the practical imperative will be as follows. So act as to treat humanity, whether in thine own person or in that of any other, in every case as an end, never as means only. Which is a great, I think, great principle to follow, a great thing to keep in mind. The second version of the categorical imperative really is about respect for persons. Never do anything that would disrespect a person. Never do anything that would in any way use a person, exploit a person. Remember, persons, and we're really talking about human beings, and there are difficult cases who a person is, but we're generally talking about people. Remember that a person is always an end in themselves and never to be exploited as a means. So these are the first categorical imperative about universalizability and consistency, and the second for respect for persons. I regard these to be the heart of Kantianism, and actually quite useful in thinking about moral decisions. In the next video, we'll go on to talk about consequential utilitarianism.